In August of 1890, our great-grandmother, Ann Rooston Fox, died at her home in Radnor, Illinois. She was survived by 3 living children and 10 grandchildren. When Mother Ann died, Sax and Mary were expecting their 5th child. Mary told her sister-in-law, Katie, but Katie did not want to have another baby. She would be leaving for Kansas, and it was no place for an infant. This would be the first time the 2 girls did not have children together. Mary's twin sister Ella was engaged to John Secretan. Katie and Mary had introduced the couple a year earlier at Mary's house. By August, they had set the date for their wedding. Ella wanted to be married on January 1st, just like her sister Mary. Katie wanted to stay for the wedding. She also wanted to be with Mary when she had her baby. It was August. They had already missed the spring planting season for that year. There was no point in moving to Kansas in the dead of winter. Sam agreed, but they would need to get there before next spring. Katie, Mary, and Ella began to plan the wedding. It was Katie's 5th wedding, with many more to come. With her marriage to John Secretan in 1891, Ella, her legal name was Helen, was given the deed to her 80-acre farm. Her father had been holding it for 10 years. Ella's land was next to her sister Mary's 80 acres and her brother William Trigger's 160 acres. A few months after Ella's wedding, Mary gave birth to her 5th child. It was a son they named Ray Stewart. Stewart was his maternal grandmother's maiden name, from Scotland. Ray was a creative child. His creative skills would grow and leave a mark on American culture that is enjoyed by millions of children to this day. It was March of 1891, and time for Katie and Sam to leave for Kansas. Spring planting was just weeks away. All of the family was there to say goodbye, including Sam's father, John Chambers. He was especially saddened. All of John's sons had married and moved away, and John was living alone. He saw his only 2 granddaughters every day, and now they were moving far away. Elizabeth was 8, Florabelle was 4. Florabelle loved her grandpa. Mary and Sax took the family to Peoria. They traveled this road on their way to the train station. Sax unloaded the Chambers luggage at the freight depot. Sam and Katie traveled on the Rock Island Railway from Peoria to Wichita. The trip took a full day. Leaving Illinois in the afternoon, the Chambers family rode overnight in a Pullman car. They arrived the next morning in Wichita. Wichita was a nice place, Katie thought. Maybe Waco won't be so bad. Sam bought a horse and a wagon and the supplies he would need for spring planting. They stopped at Bert Smith's grocery store as they were leaving town. Katie didn't like the way the men were looking at her. Dodge City was just a few miles down the road, and everyone knew what happened there only 8 years earlier. She hurried as she loaded the kids in the wagon, and they began the ride to their new home in Waco. 20 miles from Wichita, it was an all-day trip to get there. Waco, Kansas was a rough and dirty cow town, and Katie didn't like it. When she arrived at her new home, she discovered it was not as bad as she thought. It was worse. She had no neighbors. The closest family was over a mile away. The house they bought with the land was a joke. The land hadn't been plowed in years, and the prairie grass was growing in clumps thick enough to break a plow. But the well was good and the roof was solid. Sam rebuilt the house and planted his spring crops. Katie worked hard raising her 2 little girls. Sam picked up the mail every day he went to town. Late that winter there was a U.S. postal card from Illinois. It was Mary writing to Katie with good news and bad. Mary and Ella's father, William Trigger, had died, and Mary was pregnant. Katie remembered the promise they made as little girls. She wanted to raise her family together with Mary's, but she was terrified of having a child alone out on that dreadful prairie. But her friend Mary had suffered a great loss. Sam tried to discourage her. Katie had to make a decision. She was pregnant in less than 3 months. By fall harvest time, on August 28, 1893, Mary and Sax had their 6th child. It was a healthy son they named Chester Clyde. He is the grandfather we never knew. Chester idolized his father and wanted to be just like him. He was. He raised our father on the farm just as he was raised by his father, Sax. 3 months after Chester was born, in November of 1893, Katie had her child. It was another daughter they named Pearl. It was the last child for Katie and Sam. They had 3 daughters. Mary and Sax thought their family was complete also. Katie wrote to Mary telling her about Pearl. During the delivery, the only help she had was from her 10-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. She was proud of Elizabeth. She was a tough and courageous little girl and a big help around the house. Her only playmate was her sister. Reading between the lines, Mary knew things were not going good for the Chambers family out in Kansas. She was right. Sam and Katie worked hard, but things were going badly. After years of abundant rainfall, the Kansas prairie was now experiencing a drought. It was a bad one, and it persisted all the time Katie and Sam lived there. Crop yields were low, and Sam was struggling to support his family. In 1894, Kansas was hit with a blizzard, the worst in decades. Katie and Sam were snowed in for weeks with their 3 young girls. Like everyone else, they were running out of firewood and food. That is not what Katie wanted for her daughters. Elizabeth was 12 and turning into a young lady. She had no future in Kansas. There were no prospects for marriage within miles. Florabelle was 9. She still missed her grandpa. All of the girls needed their Aunt Mary. She and Sam had done the best they could, but it was time to go home. As soon as the snows cleared, the Chambers family was on the next train to Peoria. Many things were left undone. Sax and his oldest son, George, picked up the Chambers family at the train depot. They needed 2 wagons to carry all the luggage and passengers back home. George was 13 and old enough to control a horse and wagon. The trip home took 3 hours. Sax told Sam that he and Mary were planning to move to Ford County, where they had an 80-acre farm. His family had outgrown his little house, and he was going to build a new one. But more importantly, there was no high school in Radnor. His oldest son, George, was 13 and would soon be finished at the Glendale School. Mary was impatiently waiting at home. Sam's father, John Chambers, was also there, waiting to see his son and his 3 granddaughters. John still owned his 168-acre farm, including the house Sam and Katie lived in. That's where they would be staying. Walter was there at Mary's house, waiting to see his little sister Katie. Walter's wife, Nellie, had bought their entire family. Katie had never even seen the 3 youngest. Soon, everyone arrived from Peoria, and the 2 families were together again. It had been the longest 5 years of Katie's life, and there was much catching up to do. Katie was home. Sam and Katie moved back into their old house on Sam's father's property. Sax and Mary lived a little more than a mile away. Katie's children went to Glendale School with all of the other Fox children. Florabelle and Nellie were 10. George and Elizabeth would soon be 14. This would be their last year at Glendale. The nearest high school was in Dunlap, 10 miles away. Their Aunt Mary's house was halfway between their house and the school. Katie would drop the kids off and pick them up every day at Sax and Mary's house. The kids would all go there after school and usually find their mom waiting for them with Mary. The girls saw each other every day. During one of her visits, Mary had bad news for Katie. Sax wanted to move the family to Ford County. The kids could go to Gibson City High School, a real school. In 1897, the high school in Dunlap was a 2-year course and occupied the top floor of the only school building in town. The entire building housed only 80 students in all grades. 4 years earlier, in 1893, Dunlap High School was canceled because of a lack of students. Sax was totally committed to providing an education for his children. All 6 will attend, and 4 will graduate from college. He would see them attend a real high school. He liked the school in Gibson City. He saw it often as he traveled there to work his 80-acre farm. Sax and Mary were planning to move there by the start of the next school year. Katie was devastated when she heard the news. Gibson City was 70 miles away. They might as well be in Kansas. Katie soon had bad news of her own. Sam's father, John, needed to sell his property, including the house Sam and Katie lived in. He was getting too old to manage there, even with a housekeeper. Once again, the girls needed a plan, and soon they had one. Mary and Ella's older brother, William Trigger, lived next to Sax and Mary's farm. He had lived there for years and knew all of the local farmers. William learned that one of the local farms would soon be vacant, and the landowner was anxious to rent it out. It was part of the Sibley estate, and it was just a few hundred feet around the corner from Sax and Mary's farm. It was perfect for Sam and Katie, but Sam would need help to get started. Ella's husband, John Secretan, was the county manager and tax collector for Kickapoo. He was friends with Sam. That's how he met Ella. John helped Sam get established with the local political leaders in Sibley. He would soon be elected as tax collector. In the spring, Katie and Sam moved into their new house near Gibson City. Floribel missed her grandpa. Sax finished building his first house by the fall of 1897. He had very ambitious plans to expand it quickly. Both families were in their new homes just in time for school. They would begin another chapter of their lives, and Katie and Mary would raise their families together like they promised.